Hello everyone, my name is Amy Panetta. I'm an educator, researcher, and public speaker. I'm super delighted to bring to you today the American YAWP. This is the revised edition from 2026. I also recorded the first chapter of the original version, which is kind of interesting. If you go through it, you can see some contrasts in what was presented for the first edition and then the second, now the 2026 edition. You'll see elements of both Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 of 2026 within the original first chapter of the original edition. But what is American YAWP anyway? So I'm going to read from their website, AmericanYAWP.com, in the overview section of the About tab. Quote, in an increasingly digital world in which pedagogical trends are de-emphasizing rote learning and professors are increasingly turning toward active learning exercises, scholars are fleeing traditional textbooks. Yet for those who still yearn for the safe tether of a synthetic text as either narrative backbone or occasional reference material, the American YAWP offers a free and online, collaboratively built, open American history textbook designed for college-level history courses, and I'll add, published by Stanford University Press. Unchecked by profit motives or business models and free from for-profit educational organizations, the American YAWP is by scholars for scholars. All contributors, experienced college-level instructors, volunteer their expertise to help democratize the American past for 21st century classrooms. So what is a YAWP? It's a really interesting word now, isn't it? So from the Merriam-Webster's online dictionary, they describe YAWP as a loud, harsh, or raucous cry, squawk, or yell. It can be used as a noun for the sound itself or as a verb meaning to shout, yelp, or talk in a noisy, rough way. So we enter into Chapter 2, Making an Atlantic World. We're talking about Iberian expansion, African commerce and captivity, indigenous resistance, conquest, and colonial society. On the right, you'll see figure 2.1, view of Lisbon and Tagus River in the 16th century with Portuguese sailing ships Caravel and Carac. Copper engraving by Franz Hogenberg and from Civitas Orbis Terrarum. This is from Wikimedia Commons. By the way, this kind of text has me switching from, speaking mostly in English, and then you'll have words that are in various different languages. Indigenous languages, Italian, Spanish, German, some surnames that are in various languages, so, or from various nationalities. So I try to do the best I can, but sometimes I do have to stop and correct myself. So thank you for your patience that way. Here we go. Introduction. Atlantic empires created interdependent worlds. So we're tracing Spanish and Portuguese imperial systems from Mediterranean precedents. We follow connections among Europe, Africa, the Americas, and Asia. We examine colonial hierarchy alongside the limits of imperial control. So introduction. Iberian empires connected 4 continents. It's pretty massive if you think about it. Between the 15th and 16th centuries, Portugal and Spain developed imperial systems based on the islands and coastlines of the Atlantic Ocean. These systems were rooted in the commercial, cultural, legal, and military traditions of the Mediterranean world, but over time, they gave rise to entirely new societies that connected North and South America with Africa, Europe, and Asia. Beginning with the conquest and colonization of the Canary Islands, the Spanish Atlantic extended westward to the Caribbean and from there to the mainland. Having usurped the great empires of Mesoamerica and the Andes, Spanish claims to the Philippines, in the heart of the Pacific world, meant that a truly global empire had been established. Meanwhile, having occupied the uninhabited islands off its coast during the 1400s, Portugal focused its efforts in the South Atlantic, especially the territories that became Brazil and Angola, as well as bases throughout the Indian Ocean. Each of these systems expanded gradually, often with substantial lulls between periods of frenzied activity, in ways that created increasingly interdependent commercial zones. One of the enduring consequences of this interdependence was the spread of plants, animals, and microorganisms from one continent to another. Historians call this the Columbian Exchange. As Old World biota spread through the Atlantic basin, the massive transfer of human populations, along with their cultures, languages, and religions, followed. The result was, quote, a new world for all, unquote, as one historian has put it. But cultural creativity was the product of survivalism amid pain, loss, and rupture. So, by the way, the text here is footnoted. So if you would like to know this particular historian or any other references, you can go to AmericanYAWP.com. And I love the holistic view that we are getting. We're not just thinking about times and dates and events and this group met this group. We're talking about science and biota moving from one place to another. It's pretty fascinating to look at this in a holistic way, which I prefer. Yeah, Iberian expansion was never inevitable. So, yet, in the year 1400, few could have predicted that the struggling kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula, today's Spain and Portugal, would emerge as global powers over the next 2 centuries, indeed explaining late medieval Europe's economic and territorial expansion and the development of capitalism more broadly, have been some of the most challenging questions addressed by modern historians. This chapter qualifies Europe's post-1400 expansion by framing the varying motives, strategies, and consequences of colonialism, as well as the limits of imperial control. Of special interest are the economic, political, and social arrangements, all of them predicated on hierarchies of one kind or another that the Iberians used to manage their overseas empires. And our second part here, Europe enters the Atlantic. Long distance travel preceded 1492. So we're talking about replacing Iberian voyages within older Polynesian, Inuit, Arab, Chinese, and Norse roots. So obviously with that comes many different languages that I have to pronounce in this text too, which is wonderful. We connect Asian commerce, state formation, and navigational technology. Sea Atlantic islands become models for conquest and plantation slavery. Oceans connected societies before 1492. So we're looking on the right, we have figure 2.2, a Kanido world map created in Korea in 1402 depicts the old world stretching from Africa and Europe in the west to Japan in the east. It is one of the oldest surviving maps of East Asia and includes the historic capitals of China. And that was found in Wikimedia. The intensity of contact between two old worlds intensified after 1492, but trade and technology had been making the globe a more connected place for centuries. Between 1800 and 1400 CE, that's Common Era, voyagers from Polynesia discovered and populated the Hawaiian Islands. Sailing across the Pacific Ocean in massive canoes, these well prepared travelers brought family members, seedlings, animals, and tools. By the time contact between Polynesia and Hawaii ceased around 1400, Inuit peoples had completed their settlement of the Arctic, which had taken them from Siberia to Greenland. These migrations were some of the most epic in human history, yet little is known about them outside their own cultures. Now, I'm going to say something here, too. We talk about the particular discoveries made by explorers perhaps before Columbus. Um, there it seems in accounts, say, I believe the one from Jacques Cartier in what's now Quebec, that when he was dealing with first contact with the indigenous people, that it seemed to him that these folks had been in contact with other Europeans before him. And of course, before him was Columbus. But it seems like in some accounts, some of these explorers noticed that they interacted with them as the Europeans in ways as if they had already encountered Europeans before. So it's interesting to think about who came before, and the fact that so much of these stories actually were lost in a lot of different cultures. Okay. Embarking long before Europeans sought a direct route to the Indies, Arab traders, bringing with them sailing technology, Islam, and a written language, had been active in the Indian Ocean world from the 11th century onward. Between 1405 and 1433, China launched several maritime expeditions, led by Zheng He, a Muslim eunuch who became the Ming Dynasty's greatest admiral, intended to open trade and announce China's power in the Pacific and Indian Oceans. Zheng He, his fleets included tens of thousands of sailors and soldiers carried on ships that dwarfed those sailing in the Mediterranean. The admiral's fifth and sixth expeditions reached the coast of East Africa, a vibrant commercial region where Swahili city-states met the Islamic world. However, following these voyages, China's leaders turned inward, seeking a continental empire. So now, a lot of us who grew up in, hearing this kind of exploration kind of lesson earlier in life would not have heard necessarily this type of history. So I'm so glad that it is included here. The Norse crossed the North Atlantic. Quote, the people of Western Eurasia, those territories were shaped by several peninsulas and surrounded by hundreds of islands, also developed a strong maritime tradition. At their peak, Scandinavian seafarers sailed as far east as Constantinople and raided settlements as far south as North Africa. Toward the end of the first millennium, they established colonies in Iceland and southern Greenland, where several thousand Norse lived by raising livestock, fishing, and trading with their kin back in Norway. Around the year 1000, Leif Erikson reached Newfoundland in present-day Canada, literally newfound land. Unlike Greenland and Iceland, however, the Norse colony of Vinland failed within a decade. Culturally and geographically isolated, the Norse were driven back to sea by some combination of limited resources, inhospitable weather, food shortages, and Inuit resistance. The Norse ventures were largely unheard of beyond Scandinavia, and over the next few centuries, the North Atlantic was visited only sporadically by Basque, English, and Norman fishers. Asian trade drew Europe eastward. For the most part, European merchants were drawn toward Asia. They were led eastward by the enterprising traders of the Mediterranean, especially those from Genoa and Venice, who managed outposts at Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. This gave Italian merchants access to the Black Sea, as well as the Silk Road, a network of routes that connected the Islamic world with China. Between the 10th and 13th centuries, a sequence of Christian holy wars known as the Crusades failed to conquer the Holy Land from Muslim forces, but they did spark greater commercial interest in Asia. So it was the Venetian Marco Polo, alongside his father and uncle, spent 25 years traveling across Central Asia and China. His account of these travels gave European audiences their first introduction to China, sparking further interest. During the 1300s, West-East trade was facilitated by the power of Mongol Khans, whose empire was built on war, but eventually brought political stability, so-called Pax Mongolica, that long-distance trade depended upon. With demand increasing, Asian goods, principally porcelain, spices, silks, and tea, flooded European markets. This trade created new wealth represented by the merchant guilds of cities from Seville to Bruges. I'm going to stop right here. I wanted to just bring in a point that we mentioned Venice in northern Italy, that a lot of art forms that have come out of Venice also reflect an interest and the fact that they were exposed to Asian culture. So in their masks and some of the operas, some of the themes that are in the operas, in perhaps the dress, and different kinds of clothing, as well as artwork, possibly even architecture. I'd have to check that out. But it's interesting to think about because they had this influence early and it shows up in their culture, in the Venetian culture. Okay. Since goods and information moved together, the late medieval era was also a time of intellectual ferment. Emerging from the crisis of the 14th century, Europeans rediscovered or adopted Greek, Roman, and Muslim knowledge in what became known as the Renaissance or Rebirth. Universities were founded and Latin Christendom's first books were printed. Commercial integration was ultimately brought to a halt by the Black Death, an outbreak of bubonic plague, and the expansion of the Turkish Ottoman Empire, which captured Constantinople in 1453. Led by Genoese, Mediterranean merchants sought alternate trade routes. Eventually, they looked outward to the Atlantic. War and commerce strengthened monarchies. Prompted by the intensifying competition for resources and markets, fractious European polities consolidated under the authority of the most powerful warlords. Looking to the legacy of ancient Rome for inspiration, these rulers styled themselves as dukes, kings, and even emperors. By negotiating for compromises with bishops of Rome and selling offices to the nobility, they managed to centralize authority under a single sovereign. Furthermore, almost constant warfare between rival kingdoms led to deepening ties between monarchs and merchants. Unlike the privileged church and nobility, merchants had ready access to cash and were not exempt from most taxes. Over the course of the early modern period, 1400 to 1800, the centralization of military and taxation powers created Europe's nation states and the conditions for further expansion. So cultures literally were banging into each other. Reconquista shaped Iberian Empire. So what we have here on the right, figure 2.3, 15th century wedding portrait of King Ferdinand of Aragon and Queen Isabella of Castile. A Villa Madrigal de las Altas Torres, Convento de las Agustinas. This is Wikipedia. So, in what became Spain, the 1469 marriage of Fernando of Aragon and Isabel of Castile joined two of the most powerful kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula. In this region, the Crusades were just winding down. With the surrender of Granada, Europe's last independent Muslim city-state, the combined forces of Castile, Aragon, Portugal, and their allies concluded 8 centuries of intermittent warfare, mythologized as the Reconquista, the reconquest. This protracted conflict involved plenty of diplomacy, trade, and cultural exchange between Christians, Jews, and Muslims. But in the aftermath of their victory, the Catholic monarchs compelled the remaining Muslims, known as the Moors, as well as Sephardic Jews, to either convert to Christianity or leave. Similarly, beginning in 1496, Portugal attempted to forcibly convert or expel its Jewish population. Those who converted became known as New Christians, and to police the authenticity of their faith, the Catholic Church established the office of the Inquisition. This long history of begrudging toleration and repressive violence had a strong influence on Iberian encounters with the peoples of Asia, Africa, and Americas. I just love this context here. It's really important that we weren't just thrown into 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, but we see what comes before, and that's so super important. I love context. Portugal sought direct access to Africa. Having consolidated their control over both the military and merchant classes, Iberian monarchs sought to bypass the Islamic world and gain more direct access to the goods and markets of Africa and Asia. The rulers of Portugal invested heavily and acted aggressively in securing access to trade. From his estate on the coast of southern Portugal, Infante Dom Henrique, known in English as Prince Henry the Navigator, had long coveted access to the African gold and spice supply blocked by the Moors of Morocco. In 1415, he sponsored an amphibious attack on the Moroccan port city of Ceuta, which gave Portugal a foothold on mainland North Africa, and it was hoped linked to the trans-Saharan caravans that brought gold from the south. In the meantime, more ports were seized and a string of forts established from which to launch slave and livestock raids. Navigation required knowledge and risk. The prince also sponsored developments in research and technology. In the 15th century, Portuguese sailors perfected the astrolabe, a tool to calculate latitude, and the caravel, a ship well suited for exploration. Both were technological breakthroughs. Complementing the magnetic compass, which had been adopted from the Chinese, the astrolabe allowed for more precise navigation, combining Maneuverability, thanks to the triangular lateen sails invented by Arab sailors with a deep draft for carrying larger cargoes, the caravel could handle the Atlantic's rough seas. Improving technologies went hand in hand with the dissemination of cartographic and oceanic knowledge. The Atlantic is an enormous ocean with distinct wind patterns and currents acting as conduits for those who learned how to use them. Otherwise, voyages were largely restricted by the impossibility of a return trip. Italian and Iberian mariners eventually realized that they had to sail further west into the open ocean before catching to the currents of West Africa, known to Europeans as Guinea, or using the Gulf Stream to cruise home from the coast of North America. It should be remembered that these successes built upon a series of intimidating failures. In 1291, for example, Venice's Vivaldi brothers sailed into the Atlantic in search of India and were never seen again. Not to be confused with Antonio Vivaldi, who came much later. Antonio Vivaldi was a priest, actually, at St. Mark's Cathedral in Venice. Next. Okay, Atlantic islands became imperial laboratories. So if you look at the right here, Figure 2.4, illustration of indigenous inhabitants of the Canary Islands, referred to as Guanches, Canarios by Leonardo Torriani, 1590, Wikimedia Commons. The archipelagos of the eastern Atlantic include the Azores, the Madeiras, the Canary Islands, and the Cape Verde Islands were Spain and Portugal's first overseas colonies. They proved to be important models for later settlements, as well as staging grounds for contacting the coasts of sub-Saharan Africa and eventually for crossing the Atlantic. Although Roman geographers knew them as Fortunate Isles, Europeans had lost awareness of the Canaries for centuries. Beginning in the early 15th century, Norman knights, backed by the kings of Castile and Portugal, launched invasions that relied on divide and rule politics to gain a foothold. New patterns of human and ecological destruction followed. Isolation from the mainlands of Europe and Africa for millennia, the native peoples of the Canary Islands, distinctly related to Berbers, known as Guanches, were hunted as slaves, ravaged by diseases, and assimilated into Iberian society. This protracted demographic disaster presaged the one experienced by many Native American populations upon the arrival of the Spanish. Yet the successes of Guanche resistance, which relied mostly on Stone Age weapons, also hinted at the limits of European power. In 1494, a Guanche force routed a Spanish army on Tenerife, inflicting nearly 1,000 casualties, and the final campaign to conquer the islands only concluded in 1497. Sugar carried plantation slavery westward. Amid the wars of conquest, these islands became the first in the Atlantic world where sugar was cultivated by enslaved workers on large-scale plantations. Southern European trading empires like those managed by the Genoese, Catalans, Aragonese, Venetians entered the Levantine commerce in sugar and slaves in the 14th and 15th centuries. The Portuguese learned the sugar growing process from Italian merchants who acted as middlemen between them and the Muslim Mediterranean, where plantations were worked mainly by enslaved Africans and Slavic-speaking Eastern Europeans, transplanted to the rich volcanic soils of the Madeiras and São Tomé. Sugar and its byproducts became widely popular and wildly profitable. It was difficult crop to grow, but on the Atlantic islands, the Portuguese had found fertile and defensible sites to support production. From Sao Tome, the technology, techniques, and brutal labor regime of the plantation system was transported to the Caribbean and Brazil. So you can see, in Brazil, they speak Portuguese, so it's no wonder how that happened. Okay, so part 3, North and West Africa to 1500. African societies anchored global trade. So we're talking about, we're following Sahel's empires, cities, religions, and trans-Saharan commerce. We're tracing Portuguese victorias from African coast toward Brazil and India. We're examining Congo's diplomacy and growth of Luso-African merchant communities. West Africa was already globally connected. While Portuguese crews reconnoitered the coast of Africa, the continent's peoples, regions, and goods had long intrigued European travelers, but for the most part were known to them mainly through Muslim or Italian intermediaries, such as Ibn Battuta, Alvise Cadamoso, or Leo Africanus. The Catalian Atlas, a map of the known world as understood by the Jewish cartographers who produced it around 1375, vividly illustrates the European association of West Africa with powerful rulers who controlled an immense supply of gold. Depicted on the map is Mansa Musa, the ruler of the Mali Empire, who wears a gilded crown while holding a scepter in one hand and a golden orb in the other. You're going to see this in just a moment, an illustration of him. During Musa's 1324 pilgrimage to Mecca, an essential duty for every devout Muslim, his spending during a layover in Egypt allegedly caused the price of gold to drop for several years. Besides gold, sub-Saharan Africa beckoned Europeans with rumors of a lost crusader had founded a Christian kingdom near what is today Ethiopia. For their part, Africa's sub-Saharan societies from Mali to Tanzania had long been in contact with the wider world through the Islamic trade networks that connected them to the Mediterranean Sea and Indian Ocean. The Sahara became a commercial highway. Like the Americas, Africa was shaped by the great diversity of its political and religious systems. The continent's people lived in stateless band societies, small towns, and great empires, while practicing Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and thousands of animistic faiths. Like people everywhere, their identities were primarily local and mediated by extended family ties. I want to pause here because you're going to hear this word animism, animistic, and I do wish they would have defined this a bit more, because the world was not just composed of people who are of a monotheistic religion of Christianity, Islam, Judaism, but there are others as well, and one is sort of an and this is kind of a catch-all term in a way, animism. So here's a couple different definitions of it. The Cambridge Dictionary entry for animism is the belief that natural things, including plants, animals, rocks, and weather phenomena, possess spirits and can influence human events. So indigenous cultures in North America may have this belief system, or this cosmology, if you will. And then also for animistic, Oxford Learner's Dictionaries has a pretty good entry, connected with the belief that plants, objects, and natural things such as the weather have a living soul. So that's interesting, and that really helps to give us really good context here. So the expansion of Islam in Africa began with the 8th century conquest that carried Arab armies from Egypt to Morocco. From there, the faith was spread across the Sahara Desert by merchants and clerics to a region Arabs called the Sahel, meaning shore, where the savannah and the desert meet. Once a barrier, the Sahara became a highway to the Sahel, thanks to the camel caravans and oases that sustained them during the 2 month crossing. This region was watered by the Niger River, whose valley supported the rise of Go and Timbuktu, the great trading cities whose marketing gold, slaves, and salt drew travelers across the sands. From the 1100s to the 1500s, the Western Sahel was the core of several empires, including that of Mali and Songhai. Their rulers were mostly Muslim, and until the 19th century, Islam in sub-Saharan Africa remained a mostly elite and urban religion. Many of the first converts were kings who sought otherworldly alternatives after traditional rituals failed to alleviate droughts or similar problems. Paired with a written language, or Arabic, as a universal law code, Islam also appealed to Sahel kings who wished to tax, trade, and extract tribute. In converting to Islam, African kings like Mansa Musa announced their readiness to reach across the Sahara and do business with the Muslim-dominated Mediterranean. By the 1300s, Timbuktu's skyline included several mosques, and the city had become renowned as a center of Islamic learning as well as trade. So we're looking here. We've got Mansa Musa here, figure 2.5. It's a colored illustration of Mansa Musa, the ninth ruler of Mali during the kingdom's height in the 14th century. Mansa is shown atop his throne holding a gold coin, attributed to cartographer Abraham Cresque. This image is from a Catalan atlas, Bibliothèque Nationale de France, Wikimedia Commons. Portuguese roots converged on Brazil. So why don't we look at the right illustration here, figure 2.6 by the 15th century. The Portuguese had established forts and colonies on islands and along the rim of the Atlantic Ocean. Other major European countries soon followed. An anonymous cartographer created this map, known as the Cantino map, the earliest known map of European exploration in the New World, to depict these holdings and argue for the greatness of his native Portugal. Cantino Planosphere 1502, Biblioteca Estense, Modena, Italy. Wikimedia. Blending economic and religious motivations, the Portuguese were the first Europeans to make sustained contact with African societies when they established small bases, usually not more than a few dozen men, along the Atlantic coast during the 15th century. Portuguese trading routes called feitorias, or factories, dealt in gold, slave, and spices, and the profits funded further trade and exploration of the coast in a stop-and-start pattern. Embarking in 1497, Vasco da Gama sailed around the Cape of Good Hope to reach East Africa and India before making the return journey 2 years later. In 1500, the Crown dispatched Pedro Alvarez Cabral to follow up on da Gama's voyage, but his ships were blown too far west and made landfall in Brazil, falling on Portugal's side of the imaginary line created by 1494 Treaty of Tordesillas, which divided the Atlantic between Spanish and Portuguese spheres. Brazil was initially a marginal colony. During the 1500s, Portuguese and later French ships arrived to reprovision and trade with the natives for valuable dyewoods. Beginning in the 1530s, the Portuguese crown became more involved in backing colonization, and its forces succeeded in driving off the French. Small but permanent settlements were built along the coast, where merchants and soldiers began experimenting with sugar production and raiding the local indigenous peoples for slaves. Following a series of slave uprisings and droughts, of Sao Tome's merchant community migrated to Brazil, bringing with them capital, enslaved Africans, and sugar making technology. In what became a recurring pattern, it was Portugal's policy in Congo, or present day Angola, that determined the course of Brazil's colonial history. Congo and Portugal built a bicultural trade. The relationship between the kingdoms of Congo and Portugal had auspicious beginnings. In 1491, King Nzinga Nkuwu was baptized and took the name Joa I in honor of his new ally, Joa II of Portugal. An embassy was sent to Lisbon, and the king's successor, Alfonso I, continued to foster good relations. One Congolese prince was schooled in Rome and ordained as a bishop. Like the conversions to Islam in the Sahel, Christianization in the Congo was largely an elite practice involving the royal family, nobility, and courtiers. Most Central Africans continued to practice a variety of animistic religions, and in any case, Congolese Catholicism incorporated aspects of local traditions, such as the veneration of ancestors. Kinship also strengthened ties between the Portuguese and the Congolese. A small, overwhelming male population remained along the coast to trade with their African counterparts, and Portuguese merchants soon married elite women, and creating a bicultural Luso-African merchant community centered at Sao Tome, Cape Verde, and Luanda. Gold, ivory, malagueta, pepper were highly sought after, but the most lucrative traffic was increasingly the trade in enslaved human beings. Section 4, Origins of the Slave Trade. Profit transformed slavery into a system. So we're connecting sugar, captive labor, warfare, and expanding Atlantic markets. We're distinguishing early identities from later systems of racial classification. We're tracing Angola, Congo, Sao Tome, and Brazil through commerce and conflict. So Atlantic slavery transformed for centuries. We were talking about 4 continents before, and now we're talking about 4 centuries. And as it's a terrible mark on history, this slavery. But it's important that we do have some of this context that has been built up here in this particular chapter, that I think has been lacking for a lot of our history in North America with regards to how the slave trade started. Scholars continue to debate the structures of the Atlantic slave trade, which began during the 15th century and continued until the late 19th century. Across some 400 years, it is estimated that over 12 million black people were enslaved and deported to the Americas. Belonging to hundreds of different languages and cultures, most of the victims were sent to Brazil or the Caribbean. From a present-day North American perspective, it may be all too easy to forget that between 1500 and 1800, 3 Africans arrived in the Americas for every European. An unknown number of people were killed in Africa during the wars and raids caused by slavery. What is certain is that the Atlantic slave trade had a devastating impact on the peoples of Africa and the African diaspora in the Americas. The scale and scope of the Atlantic slave trade also varied considerably over time. Some African states refused to participate in the trade, while others, like Benin, did so only for a few decades. Ultimately, by commodifying human bodies, institutionalizing racism, and generating enormous fortunes, slavery utterly transformed the societies, cultures, and environments of the Atlantic world. Furthermore, the Atlantic traffic was, along with the networks in the Indian Ocean, one of several long distance slave trades that persisted across the early modern and modern eras. Sugar intensified the demand for captives. More recently, historians have looked at medieval prejudices, the price of sugar, and the demand for labor in the Mediterranean and Eastern Atlantic to locate the slave trade's origins. Having destroyed or assimilated the Guanche people of the Canaries, Portugal's would-be planters needed a new supply of workers to cultivate sugar, a labor-intensive crop. They first turned to the trade relationships that merchants had established with African city-states at the mouth of the Senegal and Gambia rivers. Since the 1440s, Portuguese sailors operating along the Senegambian coast in search of gold or a route to Asia had also kidnapped people to sell in southern Europe. Peasants provided the primary agricultural labor force in mainland Europe, so these African captives were valued primarily as domestic servants owned by elite families in Seville and Lisbon, which soon had a substantial African community, including free black Christians. With the development of sugar plantations on the archipelagos of the eastern Atlantic, enslaved Africans soon became the primary workforce on these valuable islands. Now, this brings to mind also, setting that aside, we're going to North America now, thinking about this, that actually a lot of people don't realize this, but as they started, the Europeans had contact, more and more growing contact with the New World and the people there. The indigenous people found their way to Europe, and there were a number of them in Europe itself. Whether they were kidnapped, like some explorers thought it was really a great idea to kidnap, say, the chief's son and bring them abroad, and then bring them back a couple years later. They thought that was a good idea. But anyway, there was a movement of Native people to Europe itself. So it's interesting to think about that. There is a book about that. If you do a little Google search, it's really fascinating to hear about the native or the indigenous presence in Europe around, say 1500, 1600, that kind of thing. All right, next one. Profit converted warfare into slave taking. Figure 2.7 here on the right, the first trading post built on the Gulf of Guinea and the oldest European building south of the Sahara. The Elmina Castle was established as a trade settlement by the Portuguese in the 15th century and became one of the largest and most important markets for enslaved Africans. So the caption here is view of the castle of Elmina on the northwest side, seen from the river, located on the Gold Coast in Guinea, in Atlas Blow Vanderhem, circa 1665 to 1668, from Wikimedia. Because Africans both controlled trade and were its victims, the relationship between anti-black racism and the slave trade has proved even more vexing. Interesting to think about. All right, let's take apart that sentence again, or just slow down with that sentence. Because Africans both controlled the trade and were its victims, the relationship between anti-black racism and the slave trade has proved even more vexing. It is important to recognize that 16th century Africans, like their European contemporaries, did not act according to the ethnic, national, or racial identities that exist today. At the beginning of this slave trading system, African leaders sold war captives who by custom forfeited their freedom if captured during battle for Portuguese guns, iron, and manufactured goods. In these early exchanges, slavery was a byproduct of war, but slave taking eventually became the reason for most conflicts. As the slave trade became increasingly lucrative, it ensnared more and more victims, including people who had fallen into debt or been accused of witchcraft. Observing the Senegambian slave trade during the 1500s, a Portuguese Jesuit remarked that, quote, as long as witches are sold, they will be uncovered daily, unquote. Europeans justified their actions by claiming that the people they enslaved would be rescued from paganism and converted to Christianity, a hypocrisy that was eventually normalized by the denial of black people's humanity and the entrenchment of racism. Profit was the driving force behind Atlantic slavery, and justifications were constantly contrived in the pursuit of wealth. Angola supplied Brazil's plantation economy. In West Central Africa, the destructive relationship between war and slavery intensified during the 1560s when bands of nomadic warriors known as the Jagas invaded Congo from the east. Portuguese forces helped King Alvaro fight off the invaders, but the price of their support was greater meddling in Congo's affairs. While Congolese kings had become increasingly wary of enmeshing themselves in the slave trade, the merchants of Sao Tome insisted on a steady supply of war captives. With the crown's support in 1575, Paulo Dias de Novis began the first European attempt to conquer a region of mainland Africa in what became the colony of Angola. Proceeding from his base at Luanda over the next decade, Novice forces marched up the Kwanza River, taking captives, making alliances, and building forts. When Novice died, in 1589, Portugal took control of the colony by sending royal governors and more troops. Serving short 3-year terms in a deadly disease environment, Angola's governors wanted to get rich quickly, so they aligned themselves with the slavers of Brazil and Sao Tome. After Portuguese forces sent from Brazil recaptured Angola from the Dutch, who seized much of Portugal's empire from the 1620s and 1640s, the two colonies strengthened their commercial and political ties, often beyond Lisbon's supervision. Having allied with the Dutch against their common enemy, Congo's rulers continued their effort to oust the Portuguese, but in 1665, at the Battle of Imbila, the Portuguese and their Jaga allies defeated the royal army and killed King Antonio I. For the next century, Angola, Congo, and neighboring states descended into a series of civil wars that generated hundreds of thousands of captives for the sugar plantations of Brazil. Okay, on to part 5 here, Spanish exploration and conquests. Alliance and disease-enabled conquests, or conquest. We're following Spanish expansion from the Caribbean into Mexico and Peru. We're centering Taino, Kalinago, Mexica, Quechua, and allied indigenous societies. We're separating conquest myths from diplomacy, rivalry, coercion, epidemic, and resistance. Columbus emerged from Atlantic commerce. So this is where Columbus finally emerges. It's good to have this context, as I said, because so much of us have grown up, me as an American, growing up in the Northeast, hearing from kindergarten onward, 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, but we never hear about what happened before that. At least not at that impressionable time. And so a lot of times it's left out and we don't even realize that this is part of the story. As Portugal consolidated its access to Africa and Asia, Spain yearned for its own path to empire. Christopher Columbus, a Genoese captain who had studied under Portuguese navigators, promised that opportunity. Born in 1451, just a few years before Constantinople fell to the Ottomans and blocked the land route to China, Columbus was a typical member of Genoa's far-flung merchant cohort. He was married to the daughter of a Madeira planter and had worked in West Africa's gold and slave trade. So that's something that's not always talked about here. So he's married to the daughter of a Madeira planter and had worked in West Africa's gold and slave trade. An experienced mariner and avid reader, when he died in 1506, Columbus still believed that the Caribbean islands were part of an archipelago off the coast of Japan. Isn't that interesting? Modern-day recognition of Columbus as the leading figure of a so-called age of discovery belies the very gradual, episodic, and fundamentally uncertain nature of European expansion between the 15th and 16th centuries. So we have this next slide, and we have on the right, Toscanelli's 1474 Atlantic map contrasted with the globe Columbus actually crossed. Interesting to think about, right? Wikimedia, so figure 2.8. A geographical error made the voyage seem possible. Columbus, like other educated Asians and Europeans of the 15th century, knew the world was round. So while it was technically possible to reach Asia by sailing west from Europe, thereby avoiding Italian or Arab middlemen, the Earth's vast size would doom even the greatest caravels to starvation and thirst long before they reached their destination. In a critical but fortuitous miscalculation, Columbus underestimated the size of the globe by a full 2/3 and therefore believed it was possible. After unsuccessfully seeking support for his proposed expedition in several European courts, he convinced Isabel and Fernando of Spain to provide him with 3 ships, which set sail from the Canaries in 1492. Columbus was both confoundingly wrong about the size of the earth and spectacularly lucky that a massive continent lurked in his path. After 2 months at sea, the 3 ships and their 90 men landed in the modern-day Bahamas. Spanish stereotypes marked people for conquest. The Taínos, speakers of the Arawakan language, populated the largest Caribbean islands, what came to be called Hispaniola, today's Dominican Republic and Haiti, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Jamaica, and the Bahamas. At their bustling towns, they traded, fished, and grew corn, yams, and cassava. The Taínos' rivals were the Calingagos, also known as the Caribs, who inhabited the smaller island of the Eastern Caribbean. Over the preceding centuries, the Clinagos had used their canoes and military prowess to create a trading and raiding zone that stretched from northern South America to the Lesser Antilles. Despite their impressive settlements and commercial networks, Columbus described the Tainos as childlike innocence. This is a quote that strikes me every time I read it. Quote, "These people are very gentle, not knowing what is evil, nor the sins of murder or theft." Unquote. He reported to the Spanish crown, quote, "I assure your highness that there is no better land nor people. They love their neighbors as themselves, and their speech is the sweetest and gentlest in the world, and always with a smile." Unquote. I find that particularly sad because he obviously took advantage of them, and it led to so much unspeakable tragedy there. By contrast, the Caribs, from which the word cannibal derives, were cast as ferocious savages and thus legitimate targets for Spanish invaders to kill or enslave. And see, the Spanish here have this influence that I just can't help but recognize that it's very brutal. I think one of the most brutal parts of colonization was with them at this time. I want to go back a second. Let me just check something. 2.8, yes. So looking at this map again, figure 2.8, Christopher Columbus believed that the globe was much smaller than it actually was. This map contrasts what he expected to find in brown and what actually existed in gray. Chipangu meant Japan and Cathay, China. Map of the Atlantic Ocean according to Paolo Dal Pozzo Toscanelli and Wikimedia. Just to kind of give you a little bit more context there. Gold turned encounter into enslavement. Despite his initial praise for Taino culture, Columbus had come for wealth, and at first he found little. However, he noticed that some native elites wore small gold ornaments. This changed everything. When Columbus returned to Spain, he left a few dozen men on Hispaniola and ordered them to find and secure the source of the gold. He arrived at the Spanish court to great acclaim and quickly worked to outfit a return voyage. Building upon precedents established in the Canaries, Spain's strategies and motives were clear from the beginning. If outfitted for a return voyage, Columbus promised to procure gold and enslaved laborers, claiming that, quote, "with 50 men, the in brackets, the Indians, can all be subjugated and made to do what is required of them," unquote. He was outfitted with 17 ships and over 1,000 men in what turned out to be the second of 4 voyages that he made to the Caribbean. As the gold supply ran out and previously friendly Taino leaders refused demands for tribute, the invaders embarked on a vicious campaign to extract every possible ounce of wealth from the Caribbean by enslaving its inhabitants. These captives were put to work in the gold fields or on the sugar plantations that eventually replaced them. Returning from his second voyage in 1496, Columbus's cargo included over 300 enslaved and branded Tainos, many of whom died on the way. The combination of new diseases and Spanish violence destroyed the Tainos within a few decades of contact. Conquistadors targeted indigenous empires. Just a little break here for a second. The Taino people, or the Taino people, it's interesting if you're looking at DNA um, ethnicity results, many people from Puerto Rico, like Puerto Ricans, others in the Caribbean, may find themselves with Taino heritage. So it's very interesting to think about, and also the fact that you know we often, many people, now I'm 44 years old at the time of recording this in 2026. Um, I grew up thinking, once Columbus came, they just massacred all the native people, and that was that. But that's really not the case. I just want to set that up. That there were obviously people who survived, and descendants of these Tainos are alive today, alive and well, and so it's important to think about and recognize. Yes, indeed. So we're on slide 30. As news of Columbus's conquest spread back to Europe, ambitious Spaniards poured into Americas seeking wealth and fame. Among them were members of the next generation of conquistadors, including Francisco Pizarro and Hernan Cortez, whose expeditions spread outward from the bases in the Caribbean. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, who fought alongside Cortez, described their motives succinctly. Quote, "We came here to serve God and the king and also to get rich." Unquote. As Spain's overseas empire expanded, the next generation of conquistadors encountered the empires of Central and South America, which dwarfed the city-states of North America. The most powerful Maya city-states had collapsed before European arrival, likely because of droughts and unsustainable agricultural practices. But this decline was concurrent with the rise of another Native American empire, the Aztecs. Gotta love that map on the right. So, Tenochtitlan united engineering and sacred power. I'm going to take a look at this really quick here. 2.9 16th century historical map of Tenochtitlan, capital city of the powerful Mexica or Aztec Empire. The beautiful city was built on an island in Lake Texcoco and included causeways and a huge pyramid known as Temple Mayor, where the gods of Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc were honored. Okay. Opportunistic migrants from distant lands to the north, the Mexicas, as the Aztecs called themselves, moved south into the Valley of Mexico and parlayed a series of alliances into control of an empire centered at Tenochtitlan. Founded at 1325, Tenochtitlan was an awe-inspiring city built on a series of natural and human-made islands in the middle of Lake Texcoco. Much of the city was fed by crops grown on large artificial islands called chinampas, which the Aztecs constructed by dredging rich sediment from the bottom of the lake and depositing it over time to form new landscapes. Tenochtitlan was also a holy city. A massive pyramid temple was located at the center and complemented by smaller temples and palaces. Tribute and rivalry shaped the Aztec Empire. From their island city, the Aztecs controlled or influenced much of central and southern Mesoamerica. Allied with two other city-states, Aztec rulers governed through a decentralized network of subjected peoples that paid regular tribute, including everything from the most basic items, such as corn, beans, and other foodstuffs, to luxury goods such as jade, cacao, gold, and provided troops for the empire. Meanwhile, nearby kingdoms, including the Tarascans to the northwest and the remains of Maya city-states on the Yucatan Peninsula, chafed at Aztec power. Mesoamerica's political rivalries would play a decisive role in shaping events after Hernan Cortes, an ambitious notary who had won riches in the conquests of Cuba, organized an invasion of Mexico, defying Cuba's governor, who hoped to lead the expedition himself. In 1519, Cortes landed 600 men on the coast and founded the town of Veracruz. We have this figure 210. This on the right here. Let's take a look. Uh, the Spanish relied on indigenous allies. The Tlaxcala were among the most important Spanish allies in their conquest. This 16th century drawing depicts the Spanish and the Tlaxcala allies fighting against the Purepecha. Wikimedia. Diplomacy, treachery, and alliance politics, not firearms or horses, were real tools of ensuing conquest. Relying on native translator whom he called Doña Marina, and whom Mexican folklore denounces as La Malinque, Cortes gathered information and allies. Through intrigue, brutality, and the exploitation of political divisions, he enlisted native allies, defeated Spanish rivals, and marched on Tenochtitlan. Through persuasion, the Spaniards entered the capital peacefully. Cortes then took Emperor Montezuma hostage and used him to gain control of the empire's gold and silver reserves. Eventually, the Aztecs revolted, and Montezuma was killed in a desperate retreat, mythologized by the survivors as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. The Spanish fought through thousands of indigenous soldiers and across canals to flee the city. Cortes and his lieutenants regrouped, recruited more native troops, captured Spanish reinforcements, and in 1521 besieged Tenochtitlan. The 85-day siege cut off food and fresh water. As starvation set in, smallpox ravaged the inhabitants. One Spanish observer said it spread over the people as great destruction. Some it covered on all parts, their faces, their heads, their breasts, and so on. There was great havoc. Very many died of it. They could not move, they could not stir. The Spaniards and their allies then sacked the city. The temples were plundered and 15,000 died. 15,000 died. After 2 years of war and sickness, the combined forces of Habsburg Spain and its Mesoamerican allies had toppled the Aztecs and acquired great fortunes. Greater crimes would follow. So if you are ever interested in like the numbers of those who were killed and try to look into what was the most reasonable amount and what is the most historically accurate, you can go to those footnotes and the references there on AmericanYAWP.com. Farther south, along the Andes Mountains, the Quechuas managed a vast empire, far larger and more powerful than that of the Aztecs. From their capital of Cusco in the Andean highlands, the Incas, as the Quechua kings were called, used conquest and colonization to build an empire that stretched through the western half of South America, from present-day Ecuador to central Chile and Argentina. Generals, bureaucrats, and engineers were important functionaries in this far-flung domain, with multiple provinces and active military frontiers. Terraces were cut into the sides of mountains to farm fertile soil, and by the 1400s, 1,000 miles of roads and bridges tied together perhaps 12 million people. Similar to the situation in Mesoamerica, Unrest between the Incas and conquered groups created tensions and left the empire vulnerable to invaders. Carried along trade networks by human hosts, plague spread in advance of the Spanish and hit the Inca Empire in 1525. Epidemics ravaged the population, cutting the empire's population in half and killing Emperor uh, Huayna Capac and many members of his family. A bloody war of succession ensued between two half brothers, Huascar and Atahualpa. So on the right we have the heading I have here: the conquest of Peru lasted for decades. So figure 211 on the right here. The Peruvian painting depicts Manco Capac in the early 13th century. He may have been one of the founders of the Incan civilization in Cusco. This is from the Brooklyn Museum and accessed on Wikimedia. It was into this dynastic chaos that Francisco Pizarro intervened after he landed a small force on the Pacific coast and marched inland. Pizarro drew from the same Czech playbook as Cortez, for he relied heavily on deceit and native allies to seize power. Yet after executing Atahualpa and occupying Cusco in 1533, the conquest of the Inca Empire became a drawn-out affair that involved defeating armies led by Atahualpa's generals and a civil war between Spanish factions, each of which relied on mostly native troops. Pizarro was assassinated by his rivals in 1541, and a year later his brother Gonzalo led a revolt that threatened to create an American kingdom separate from Spain. Of course, they didn't call it American yet. Gonzalo and the other leading rebels were eventually captured and executed, but it was only in 1572 that the last Inca, who ruled an independent state in the jungles east of Peru, was defeated. Finally, Part 7, Spanish America. Spain built hierarchy atop native empires. So we're linking cities, mines, labor systems, and bureaucracies to Habsburg power. We examine reform, colonial violence, and the Black legend. We're tracing patriarchy, caste, mestizaje, religion, and environmental change. Habsburg Spain governed a global patchwork. After the conquest of Mexico and Peru, Habsburg Spain began restructuring its overseas possessions, which now belonged to an empire of global proportions. Already the King of Spain, when Charles V became the Holy Roman Emperor in 1519, his domains included lands from Austria to Castile, and the wealth generated by the conquest of Cortez and Pizarro allowed him to dream of a universal monarchy, power unseen since the glory days of Rome. Yet, like its ancient predecessors, the Spanish Empire was a patchwork of regions and cultures that strained managerial capacities, even as it generated enormous wealth for the metropole. Cities and silver-powered Habsburg ambition. Building upon the infrastructure of the great Native American empires, the new imperial cores of highland Peru and central Mexico were marked by cities, highways, and mines. From the Spanish perspective, urbanization was an important part of imposing law and order on a new environment and its peoples. The great metropolis of Mexico City was built directly upon the ruins of Tenochtitlan, with the stones of Templo Mayor, used to construct a cathedral and the viceroy's palace. In 1573, Philip II codified directives for founding new cities, which were supposed to have a grid of wide streets surrounding a central plaza, itself lined by a church, armory, and other administrative buildings. The reality on the ground often proved quite different. Usually constructed near indigenous towns or trade routes, many colonial settlements sprang up haphazardly as mineral strikes were made from the mid 16th century onward. The outstanding example is Potosi in modern day Bolivia, where silver was found in the 1540s. Within a few years, shanties, shops, and mining camps, home to over 200,000 people, choked the lowlands around the mountain. Complemented by the 1446 discovery of silver at Zacatecas in northern Mexico, the new mining centers powered the Habsburg ambitions. The importance of American silver to funding Spain's army and fleets only became greater once the Protestant Reformation solidified anti-Spanish resistance by the English and Dutch. Okay, so we have this image on the right. Encomienda joined labor, tribute, and power. You can take a look at this for a moment. Take a look at this slide. I would like to just tell you just a little bit about the Habsburg Empire. And because they mention it, but they don't really tell you exactly who they were. So at least as far as right now. So the Habsburg Empire is a large multi-ethnic collection of European territories ruled by Habsburg dynasty and centered in Austria. And then in 1867, it was reorganized as Austria-Hungary. And one more second. The Habsburg dynasty originated near Habsburg Castle in present-day Switzerland during the 11th century. The family, so it's the Habsburg family, gained control of Austria in the late 13th century and expanded its territories through warfare, inheritance, and especially strategic marriages. In 1526, the Habsburgs acquired the crowns of Bohemia and Hungary, creating a collection of Central European territories commonly called the Habsburg Empire. Important to know that context, just a bit of context there. So what are we looking here? Figure 212, illustration of Spanish conquistadors' atrocities in the conquest of Hispaniola by Flemish artist Theodore de Bry. One soldier prepares to hurl a child against a wall while hungers are hung above flames. Bibliothèque Nationale de France, Wikimedia. This is pretty brutal. The emerging empire managed labor relations through a system known as the encomienda. In this feudal arrangement, the crown awarded indigenous laborers, generally the adult population of multiple villages, to elite colonists called encomenderos. So encomiendas granted workers and tribute as well. Furthermore, these vast estates could be subdivided and inherited, creating the basis of wealth for the conquistadors and their descendants. The system was rife with the abuse of native workers, and it also threatened to create a colonial nobility that was independent of royal control. In response, Charles V and his successors asserted greater authority over their overseas possessions. I'm going to just check on something very quickly here. Okay. to you with that in a minute. Las Casas expose conquest atrocities. Not all Spaniards supported these injustices. In fact, a planter turned friar, Bartolome de las Casas, traveled to the New World in 1502 and later wrote an expose of the atrocities being committed, appealing to the sensibilities of the king and queen who had instructed Columbus to convert the natives to Christianity. Las Casas described Spanish brutalities in gory detail, along with witnessing victims torn apart by war dogs. Las Casas saw, quote, saw with these eyes of mine the Spaniards for no other reason, but only to gratify their bloody mindedness, cut off the hands, noses, and ears, both of Indians and Indianesses, unquote. The writing of Las Casas and other reports of the conquest were later used by Dutch and English propagandists to craft a narrative known as the Black Legend, in which Spaniards and Catholics were, more broadly, were depicted as uniquely vicious and greedy. In fact, none of Europe's colonial powers had a monopoly on hypocrisy. Nevertheless, the scale of this initial destruction was remarkable. By the 1520s, the indigenous population of Hispaniola had collapsed, and many of the surrounding islands had been emptied by Spanish slave raiders, who left behind herds of feral pigs and cattle. Historians' estimates of the island's pre-contact population ranged from fewer than 1 million to as many as 8 million. Las Casas estimated it at 3 million. In a few short years, they were practically gone. Quote, who in future generations will believe this? Unquote. Casas wondered. Quote, I myself, writing it as a knowledgeable eyewitness, can hardly believe it. Unquote. So I wanted to, I see this word tribute come up so frequently in our text here every so often. So I wanted to just go over a definition of this. Tribute is a required payment of money, goods, crops, or labor made by a subject population to a ruling authority. In the Merriam-Webster Online Dictionary, it defines this historical sense as, quote, a payment by one ruler or nation to another in acknowledgement of submission, unquote. So, as we're talking about in this encomienda system, the tribute meant the goods, crops, precious metals, money, or labor that indigenous communities were compelled to provide to the encomendero. It does not mean an expression of praise here. So that's important, because it might be easy for people to think they're talking about, you have to, really kiss up to them or something. Let's go back a second. Slide 41. Yes, indeed. So, reform changed the system, not the exploitation. Interesting to think about there, because there are plenty of systems throughout the years that still continued this oppression and exploitation. We can see this in the United States. We can see this in Canada and the colonies that preceded those, and other places around the world. Okay, so in 1542, due in part to Las Casas' efforts, the Crown promulgated the new laws of the Indies for the good treatment and preservation of the Indians, which revoked many of the conquistadors' privileges and prohibited new grants of encomiendas. In Peru, encomenderos' resentment of the new policies erupted into an armed rebellion against the crown led by Gonzalo Pizarro. After crushing this revolt, the crown replaced the encomienda system with the repartimiento system. Intended as a mild tribute system, the repartimiento facilitated many previous abuses. The rapacious exploitation of the native population continued. On the other hand, important lessons were learned and precedents established. Through a combination of exemplary punishment and compromise, the Crown had withstood a major challenge and learned to govern in partnership with local elites. Now I'm going to check on something again. Okay, in the meantime, I'm going to go to the next slide. On the right, we have figure 213 in this startling image from the Kingsborough Codex. It's a book written and drawn by native Mesoamericans. A well-dressed Spaniard is shown pulling the hair of a bleeding, severely injured indigenous person. The drawing was part of a complaint about Spanish abuses of their encomiendas. That's from Wikimedia. So our heading here, a layered bureaucracy governed native majorities. I want to tell you too, we were talking about Francisco Pizarro and Gonzalo Pizarro. So Gonzalo was actually Francisco's younger half-brother. Interesting to think about. He accompanied Francisco during the Spanish conquest of the Inca Empire and later rebelled against Spanish royal authority in Peru. And important to understand how people are connected here. The administration of the Aztec and the Inca empires was taken over by the crown through the establishment of two viceroyalties, New Spain in 1535 and Peru in 1544. Reporting to the Council of the Indies based in Seville, the viceroys were always high-ranking noblemen born in Spain, and only the archbishops sent to the Americas rivaled them in prestige and authority, simultaneously imposing imperial governance and checking the viceroy's power. Were the judicial councils composed of leading urban colonists called audiencias. Crown-appointed governors were the legal and military executives who headed individual provinces, in turn supported by the municipal councils, cabildos, of chartered towns, villas. Meanwhile, Spanish migrants poured into the New World, with some 225,000 arriving during the 16th century. Often single, young, and male, these people immigrated for the promises of land, wealth, and social advancement. Laborers, craftsmen, soldiers, clerks, and priests all came in large numbers, but indigenous people always constituted a majority and were therefore incorporated into colonial life by necessity. In theory, native peoples constituted a social sphere outside the Spanish world, the so-called República de Indios, in which they were managed by traditional leaders, drawn by employment opportunities and desperate to escape the drudgery of encomiendas. Thousands of Indians flocked to cities like Cusco, Lima, or Mexico City. However, native incorporation into urban spaces and related process of acculturation did not mean equality. And again, like I said, they made their way over to the to Europe as well. Patriarchy structured colonial households. I'm just thinking of this as a juxtaposition of a lot of the matrilineal societies of the native indigenous people and the Americas. It's interesting to think about. Intersecting ideas about class, gender, and race structured social hierarchy in Spanish America. The Iberian society transplanted to the Americas was fundamentally patriarchal, guided by the ideal of a senior man who protected subservient members of his household. So we have wife, children, employees, in exchange for their labor and obedience. Intended to be a microcosm of the monarchical state, for noblemen, patriarchy achieved its full expression in the great estates that encompassed an urban residence and rural lands worked by servants and slaves. Yet there are simply too few Spanish women in the Americas to support the natural growth of a purely European descended population. Legal precedents already existed in Iberia for managing the consequences of extramarital affairs, practices that were then applied to the relationships between Spanish men and black and native women. Building upon histories of intercultural encounter in the Mediterranean world, where Muslims and Christians had been capturing and converting each other for centuries, the Spanish tolerated and sometimes even supported interracial marriages. Beginning with baptism, illegitimate mixed-race children were thus formally recognized while remaining subordinate. Indeed, the line between servant and relative were often blurred. I don't like that word illegitimate, and I know a lot of people might be like, what's that word, illegitimate? It is a word that is used in historical records. Illegitimate as well, you know, if a husband and wife aren't married, for instance. But we're using this as the word that's historically used, even though I don't like it one bit. But that's how they were addressed and how they were viewed at that time. Okay, so on the right here, figure 214, Spanish cast paintings showing 16 racial classification in Spanish colonies in the Americas, 18th century. Instituto Nacional de Antropología y Historia, Museo Nacional de Vallenato, Wikimedia. If you're interested in this, you know that you can get this on Wikipedia or Wikimedia. So I would just Google that and take a closer look at this, as it is worth. It's kind of interesting how they broke this down and what that was like within our history. And when I say our history, I mean global history, really. From the New World and the Old World colliding, you know. So, the frequency of cross-cultural sex often coerced manifested new racialized systems of social control, regularized in the mid-1600s but rooted in older practices for excluding Moors and Jews. The Sistema de Castas, the caste system, organized individuals into various ethno-racial groups based on their supposed, quote, purity of blood, unquote. Not surprisingly, Spaniards, Españoles, were at the top of this hierarchy. Although the first generation of conquistadors and encomenderos dominated colonial society, they soon had to make room for other European migrants and the rising population of American-born colonists called criollos. Mestizos, an elastic term used to describe those of mixed European, black, and indigenous heritage, ranked below Españoles in the emerging racial order. Nevertheless, this idealized system of social control and the reality of life in the colonies were two different things. And by the way, you can find this image obviously on the American YAWP website for 214 on their website in the 2026 edition. Spanish fathers of sufficient status might shield their mestizo children from racial prejudice, and wealthy mestizos married Europeans to whiten their family lines. In frontier areas where there were fewer colonists, it was often easier for mestizo families to emphasize their European heritage and thereby construct differences between themselves and native groups, such as was the case on the frontiers of Portuguese Brazil or Spanish Texas. So, mestizaje created new cultural forms. Figure 215, Our Lady of Guadalupe, is perhaps the most culturally important and extensively reproduced Mexican Catholic image. In this iconic image, Mary stands atop the tilma, or the peasant cloak of Juan Diego, on which, according to his story, appeared the image of the Virgin of Guadalupe. Throughout Mexican history, the story and image of Our Lady of Guadalupe has been a unifying national symbol. Mexican retablo of Our Lady of Guadalupe, 19th century. So this is by an anonymous Mexican painter, El Paso Museum of Art from Wikimedia. Mestizos soon made up large portion of the colonial population, and by the early 1700s, more than one-third of all marriages bridged the Spanish indigenous divide. The result was a level of mixture of mestizaje that distinguished Spanish America's hybrid culture, one where African, Iberian, and indigenous languages, religions, fashions, and cuisines commingled. In 1531, a poor indigenous man named Juan Diego reported that he was visited by the Virgin Mary, who appeared as a dark-skinned Nahuatl-speaking indigenous woman. Reports of miracles spread across Mexico, and the Virgin de Guadalupe became a national icon for the new mestizo society. Sounds like a unifying force, really. Silver provoked environmental war. Finally, in 1546, a group of Basque prospectors located silver deposits near what became the city of Zacatecas. The Mexican counterpart to the mines of Potosi, the silver of Zacatecas fueled the ambitions of the Habsburg dynasty. The extraction of precious metals came at a steep environmental cost. Forests were cut and burned to fire the smelters that refined the ore, leaving behind slag, cinders, and mercury. Hundreds of thousands of sheep were unleashed on Mexico's grasslands, followed by drought and erosion. Pulled by the silver rush, colonists and their livestock provoked one of the longest conflicts in American history, the Chichimeca War of 1550 to 1600. Used to describe the semi-nomadic peoples of the mountainous and arid region north of Mesoamerica. Chichimeca was a Nahuatl word equivalent to the European term barbarian. More accurately, the Chichimecas were an alliance of several nations who organized to defend their homelands in the face of miners, ranchers, and slavers. The effectiveness of Chichimeca's guerrilla tactics led to the deployment of royal troops, construction of fortified bases, and armed escorts to guard the silver-laden convoys. After military and church officials debated the issue, the king sanctioned a total war of fuego y sangre, fire and blood, that permitted the enslavement of Chichimeca prisoners. The intertwining of war and slaving only hardened Chichimeca resistance, and by 1585 the war had become a bloody stalemate. Disease magnified conquest and displacement. Biology magnified the devastating impact of European invasion. Separated from the Old World, its domesticated animals, and its immunological history, Native Americans lived free from the terrible diseases that ravaged populations in Asia, Europe, and Africa. Because of this relative isolation, Native Americans lacked the acquired immunities that Europeans and Africans had developed over centuries of exposure to deadly epidemics like malaria and various poxes. So when the newcomers arrived in the Americas, they unleashed a host of new plagues: smallpox, typhus, influenza, diphtheria, measles, and hepatitis, to name a few, that devastated native communities. Rape was used as a weapon of war by European armies, and sexual violence on a massive scale produced a more virulent strain of syphilis, leading to more deaths. The ability of the survivors to remain healthy and reproduce was also compromised by trauma, malnutrition, and other social determinants of health. In short, war, slaving, and epidemics worked together to scythe the indigenous populations. Some scholars estimate that as much as 90% of the population of the Americas perished within the first century and a half of European contact, a demographic cataclysm known as the Great Dying. And if you want to look into how they figured out it was 90%, or if you would like to look into different opinions about that, you can take a look at their references in the footnotes as well. So we have part 8, Spanish North America. North America exposed imperial limits. So we're following entradas through Florida, Texas, the Southwest, and California. We're centering indigenous power, hospitality, diplomacy, resistance, and adaptation. We're tracing the shift from military conquest toward missions and permanent colonies. So I'm looking at North America. I'm just going to say this. It really would be good someday for it to be, sure, the American YAWP, but it should be more a North American YAWP, because there's a lot going on in Canada and a lot that hopefully the American YAWP goes into, but in what is now Canada, there was a lot going on as well. You know, again, like I said before, a lot of us were brought up with this notion that the native people were wiped out completely, but it's obviously not true. So many people are descendants of native peoples, of indigenous peoples, and so we can't think that they just disappeared, because that also illegitimates their lived realities now, because they're living now, they're descendants, and they're here in the Americas, and we need to be able to be to understand that they do exist, and that, you know, even in the 19th century in Canada, for instance, a large area of land in the western area was controlled by indigenous people, and a lot of people don't realize that. So I'm just going to put that out there now. I might say that again in another chapter, but it is very important to understand that it isn't as simple as some of us have grown up believing, you know. And for younger people, maybe you have had the information that some of us were not afforded growing up. So hopefully, hopefully this context makes sense, and it's important for all of us. But I think a holistic version of American YAWP, where it's North American or even the Americas, really would be helpful. And I think that's what's going on here as well. They're trying to do the best they can with this and integrate as many pieces as possible. Okay, entradas searched North America for plunder. The great wealth from Spanish America was centered in Central and South America, but Spain ventured north as well. As mestizo societies developed in the mining and urban centers, privately financed military expeditions called entradas were organized to find other indigenous empires to plunder. Led by veteran conquistadors, these expeditions included hundreds of soldiers, priests, guides, and enslaved people, supported by enormous numbers of livestock. Juan Ponce de Leon, the conqueror of Puerto Rico, landed in Florida in 1513 in search of gold and enslaved laborers. The reality of staunch indigenous resistance and a swampy coastline never aligned with Ponce de Leon's imagination. And in Florida, he found only an early grave, courtesy of a poisoned arrow by the Calusa people. With the exploration of the Gulf of Mexico and the coast of California between 1520s and 1540s, as the contours of the North American mainland came into focus, others tried where Ponce de Leon had failed. I think also, and we might be getting into this in American YAWP, a lot of us in the United States, I'm speaking for myself here, we often pronounce it not Puerto Rico or Puerto Rico, but we say Puerto Rico. And it's precisely that word Porto, where that was a former word. That was a former name for Puerto Rico. So it's worth it to take a look at that if this American YAWP does not go into it. So we might get there. We will see. Misunderstanding turned refuge into conflict. In 1528, Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca joined Panfilo de Narváez. So we have Cabeza de Vaca, Ponce de Leon. Okay, so you know these names. Panfilo de Narváez expedition from Cuba to find the Rio de las Palmas, 125 miles south of the Rio Grande. But due to consecutive storms and the powerful Gulf Stream, they erroneously landed on the west coast of Florida. After being separated from their supply ships, they built rafts in hopes of sailing again to their destination. Unfortunately, the crew shipwrecked on the coast of present-day Texas and embarked on a remarkable multi-year odyssey that took them from the Texas coast all the way to Sonora. This epic trek further spread diseases and led to a host of disasters due to language barriers and the Spaniards' insistence on their superiority. For example, when the explorers encountered the Tocobaga in the Tampa Bay area, they found shipwrecked European crates, each containing a dead body. The Tocobaga had treated the deceased Europeans with respect by carefully wrapping them in valuable painted skins, but Fray Juan Suarez and the accompanying bishop misinterpreted the act as devilish idolatry and had the crates and bodies burned, despite being on sacred ground. Afterward, relations between the Spaniards and Tocobaga quickly deteriorated, and the explorers were expelled. Florida's native nations controlled the route. So, figure 216, a Timuacan village in northern Florida with 3 indigenous people. 2 women carry food and other items, and a man has drawn his bow and arrow. Oil painting by artist Alan Cox, architect of the Capitol, Wikimedia. As the group traversed the coast, they glimpsed cornfields and gold pieces among the local Uzita. After laborious questioning, they learned that the Apalachee people, who were said to have more of each. The crew left to find the Apalachee people, where they hoped to seize riches to rival Tenochtitlan. Along the way, the group found marshes, canopies of pine trees, and several rivers, which served as borders between indigenous groups. When expeditioners crossed rivers, they encountered different territories where they were treated as trespassers, especially when they devoured local cornfields. One day, the Timucua, led by Chief Dulchan Chalin, approached the camp and communicated using signs and exchanged gifts. After painstaking deliberation, the Spaniards understood these were enemies of the Appalachians who were willing to lead them in the right direction. Finally, in mid-June 1528, the men came within sight of the Appalachia, the largest and most complex chiefdom occupying the Florida Peninsula, and one of the few powerful chiefdoms from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. Appalachian resistance protected Anhaica. The Appalachians had extensive agricultural practices, organized hierarchical societies, and long-distance trade routes. Their capital city, Anhaica, so it's Anhaica, was at its center, where a paramount chief lived, projecting influence over several outlying capitals, and where subordinate village chiefs ruled over their surrounding small lands. Early 17th century witnesses estimate populations from 30,000 to 34,000 in the Appalachia region. Captain Narvaez ordered Cabeza de Vaca to attack an outlying Appalachia village, using women and children as hostages to trade for the village chief. To the Spaniards' surprise, they were met with an organized militant resistance and were forced to retreat. The captured chief convinced the expeditioners to go back to the coast and toward the Aote. In doing so, he protected his people by driving the Spaniards away from the capital and toward the enemy. Appalachia would continue to maintain a stronghold in the area until the 18th century. Shipwreck reversed the balance of power. Desperate for survival, the expedition turned for the Gulf Coast near present-day St. Mark's to build rafts and sail toward the coast of Mexico. Unfortunately, the rafts were again shipwrecked on the coast of modern-day Texas, with fewer than 80 survivors, and Narvaez perished en route. Near present-day Galveston, de Vaca and his men encountered a band of Karankawa who provided the expeditioners with food and wept for their fallen men before carrying the Spaniards to their village for refuge. Soon the castaways would overstay their welcome by failing to pull their own weight, and a relationship between guest and host deteriorated into master and slave. For the next 6 years, the castaways endured harsh, trivial work, including carrying wood, digging for roots, and fetching water, while facing violence for minor infractions. Because the Karankawa did not engage in the slave trade generally, de Vaca and his men found opportunities to leave one clan for another. Cabeza de Vaca became trader and healer. By 1529, the remaining Spaniards left for New Spain and abandoned Cabeza de Vaca before he became a neutral broker for the Charrucos. He traded sea beads, shells, and fruit for hides, glue, and flint before finding 3 other Spaniards and eventually making their escape together. In September 1534, de Vaca and 3 men ventured through South Texas to present-day Mexico, where they were considered respectable healers. In their captivity, they had occasionally joined healing ceremonies and made signs of the cross on the sick and injured. Thus, they were refashioned as medicine men. In 1535, near West Texas, de Vaca completed the first recorded surgical procedure in the American Southwest. An Avivarez man was struck by an arrowhead below the shoulder. De Vaca cut open the wound, extracted the weapon, and stitched the wound closed. The arrowhead and the story were passed around indigenous communities. As a result, they were met with celebration festivals and considered holy men. The Spaniards' growing reputation ultimately led to their safe return to Mexico City. As from then on, the foursome were accompanied by thousands of natives who willingly followed Devaka's orders throughout his travels. Women traveled ahead as guides to ensure safe passage, since the men might have been mistaken for a war party. Adaptation challenged Spanish ideas of rule. Devaka's experience was unusual for a European. Along the journey, he learned to speak 6 different indigenous languages and navigate a host of indigenous customs. He also found New World maize, the American buffalo, and signs of copper. To survive, he adapted to indigenous life, embracing herbal cures and encouraging a softer approach to native relations. Upon his return to Mexico City, he attempted to continue ritual gift giving, a practice he learned on his travels. However, the concept did not align with Spanish ideas of tribute and subjugation. Devaka's stories of the indigenous interior, including tantalizing stories of great cities, prompted another round of attempted conquests. Coronato brought a multi-ethnic army west. Meanwhile, sponsored by the wealth of his wife's family and the viceroy's favoritism, between 1540 and 1542, Francisco Vasquez de Coronato led an entrada that rampaged across the southwest and Great Plains. Like all Habsburg armies, Coronato's was a truly international and multi-ethnic force, including Tlaxcalan guides, Tlaxcalan guides, African porters, Flemish mercenaries, and even a Scottish bugler. On July 7th, 1540, having reached the upper Rio Grande, Coronato's army founded Hawiku, a small town of Zuni or Pueblo people, so named because their clustered multi-story adobe buildings resembled Spanish villages. Pueblo diversity answered a difficult environment. Pueblo Indians are believed to be descendants of the Anasazi, Mongolian, or Hohokam cultures. Acoma, Zuni, Hopi, and Tewa are among the most recognizable tribal names. Pueblos are a diverse people with some shared cultural practices. For example, Western Pueblos are matrilineal. Women own homes and fields, while Eastern tribes such as the Acoma and Laguna are organized by moieties, that's it. Moieties, dual organization. They also have as many as 7 different languages. Native to the Southwest, Pueblo culture was shaped by its harsh environment. All practiced some form of farming, but the nature of it changed based on geography. For instance, the Zuni and Hopi practiced dry farming, while others near the Rio Grande dug irrigation ditches. As the population swelled, housing structures shifted from pit houses to surface dwelling rooms with storage rooms. In the 1300s, due to the great drought and overpopulation, the Pueblo people migrated south to the northeast of Arizona, Texas, and northwestern New Mexico. The move led to another change in housing to adobe brick, multi-storied attached homes, or limestone cliff dwellings with attached adobe structures like those at Mesa Verde. Chaco Canyon and Pueblo Bonita developed around the 13th and 14th centuries. The Zuni drew a sacred boundary. So we're looking here on the right, figure 217, Zuni Kachina doll, often carved of cottonwood root, served as messengers to the gods. The colors and regalia indicated the doll's unique purpose. So this is from the Brooklyn Museum, 1903, World History Encyclopedia, Creative Commons. Upon Coronato's arrival, Zuni and Spaniards alike eyed one another suspiciously. Coronado promptly had requerimiento, a 1513 royal decree that Spain had the divine right to possess New World territories and subjugate native peoples, demanding that the Zuni accept Spanish rule and embrace Christianity, despite their incomprehension of the words. He also informed them that resistance would be met with a loss of land, their lives, or enslavement. The Zuni reacted first by drawing a line of sacred corn not to be crossed by the Spaniards. When that did not work, they fired arrows at the Spanish party, resulting in the destruction of the village. The explorers ventured deeper into the interior of current-day New Mexico, where they met Tiwa-speaking people near current-day Albuquerque. Coronato's failure exposed imperial limits. After besieging and occupying a dozen towns over the winter of 1540 to 1541, Coronato's army was led westward onto the grasslands in search of the fabled city of Quivira, or central Kansas. His guide was an indigenous man known as the Turk, whose real mission was to get the Spaniards so hopelessly lost that they could never return to terrorize the pueblos. Along the way, the Coronado expedition came across Tiwesh, scattered villages of the Tiwa people. Pedro de Castaneda described the encounter, noting their clothing and labor division. While initially very hospitable, the Tiwa became hostile when the adventurers continued to exhaust their food stores and one soldier raped a woman. The ensuing violence led to many fatalities. Although Coronado and some of his men made it back, his failure made it clear the limits of conquest. Coronato's visit is still remembered today by the Pueblo, who depict him on a dancing horse holding a sword. Without the sugar-friendly climate of the Caribbean or large indigenous empires to co-opt and extort, the vast North American interior offered little incentive for renewed invasions. Still, smaller expeditions combed northern Mexico all the way to the Rio Grande, looking for people to enslave if no other resources could be found. California legend obscured native diversity. Even as Spaniards were exploring the northern American interior, they were simultaneously looking for strategic locations along the Pacific coast. Tales of Amazonian women and a land of paradise stoked people's imagination. For example, a Spanish writer wrote, quote, "Know that to the right hand of the Indies was an island called California, very near the region of the terrestrial paradise, which was populated by black women, without there being any men among them. They were of vigorous bodies and strong and ardent hearts of great strength. Their arms were all of gold. In all the island there was no other metal whatsoever." In reality, the native people of California were fishermen, farmers, and hunters in much the same way as other parts of North America. There were 6 cultural areas and roughly 100 dialects before Spanish contact. In southern and central California, serrano and cahuilla acorns were the primary food source, while northern California Indians, ipai and tepai, were hunter-gatherer societies. Coastal Indians, Chumash and Tongva, relied on seafood and built canoes of driftwood. Pacific communities resisted repeated intrusions. So here on the right, figure 218, Sunrise Chumash, crossing from the Channel Islands harbor to Santa Cruz Island in a traditionally built tumul plank canoe. These crossings were rites of passage and celebration of the Chumash's connection to the sea. This is a photo by Robert Schwemmer in NOAA or NOAA, Wikimedia. Indians on the Monterey region of the Central Coast, the children of the Coyote, were aware of various Spaniards' expeditions in North America from interior natives and those in Baja California. After his victory in Tenochtitlan, Cortes dispatched explorations along the Pacific coast that met with little success. In 1533, Fortun Jimenez that's it, sailed into southeastern part of the Baja Peninsula and was met by Waikura warriors. He and most of his men perished. Those who returned spoke of pearls and gold. Still, it was not until 1542 that veteran conquistador Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo arrived at the Bay of San Diego. Upon landing, he was met with fear and hostility, which he assuaged with gifts. The Ipai retold stories of other men killing many native people. Upon Cabrillo's death, his second in command, Bartolomé Ferrer, explored 1,200 miles up the Pacific coast and claimed it for Spain. Permanent occupation would not come until 1789, when an expedition led by Franciscan Father Junipero Serra established a mission and presidio at current-day San Diego. Missions replaced conquest with pacification. So we look on the right here. We have figure 219, Spanish mission map depicting 21 Franciscan missions in Alta California, Wikimedia. Burdened by the mounting costs of war in America and Europe, Spain shifted its colonizing strategies toward the end of the 16th century. The popes provided religious sanction for the Iberian conquest from the start, but in his 1573 reforms, Philip II emphasized alternative methods for subjugating indigenous peoples, with the rhetoric of conquest giving way to that of pacification. Converting native peoples became a greater priority. This ideological imperative was only heightened by the Reformation, as Native American converts were seen as a way of compensating for the loss of rebellious Protestant subjects in the Netherlands and elsewhere. Indeed, religious institutions like the Inquisition were always understood as mechanisms for enforcing orthodoxy. Colonists and most sedentary natives were already being ministered to by the secular clergy, which includes officials from parish priests all the way to bishops who ran the viceregal diocese. However, along the frontier between Spanish colonies and indigenous homelands, a different set of ecclesiastical institutions led the way. Organized by mendicant orders, most prominently the Franciscans and the Jesuits, missions and missionaries became the vehicles for subjugating North America's largely non-sedentary indigenous peoples. Taking vows of poverty in emulation of the apostles, most missionaries were highly educated men who combined a medieval Christian mysticism with a fervent desire to bring, quote, heathen, unquote, people to, quote, true faith, unquote. Embedding themselves in native communities, they learned local languages, challenged the authority of indigenous shamans, and encouraged people to live in a more nucleated settlements where they could take up European-style agriculture, seeing themselves as Christian soldiers fighting to redeem the New World from Satan's grasp. The aggressive attitude of many missionaries led them to martyrdom. Oñate tried to rule New Mexico through terror. One of the first and most promising mission fields was the Franciscan experiment in the remote northern province of New Mexico. Juan de Oñate, a Zacatecas silver baron, who was related by marriage to both Montezuma and Cortez, was determined to revive Coronato's efforts to conquer the Pueblo villagers of the Rio Grande. Let me slow down here for a second. So Juan de Oñate, a Zacatecas silver baron, who was related by marriage to both Montezuma and Cortez, so both indigenous and Spanish, interestingly enough, was determined to revive Coronato's efforts to conquer the Pueblo villagers of the Rio Grande. So we have someone of mixed ethnicity there wanting to help the effort of colonization. Interesting. After years of preparation, in 1598, he led 400 settlers, soldiers, and Franciscan missionaries from north of the Rio Conchos, crossed the Rio Grande at El Paso, and established headquarters at San Juan, New Mexico. This trip was different from earlier military ones. Oñate was determined to establish a permanent colony. Like other 17th century colonies, New Mexico had violent beginnings. After Oñate sacked the Mesa Top village of Acoma for resisting his invasion, his troops slaughtered nearly half its roughly 1,500 inhabitants, including women and children. Oñate ordered 1 foot cut off every surviving male over the age 15, and he enslaved the remaining women and children. This theatrical brutality reflected the Spaniards' siege mentality as they attempted to rule through force and terror. As Oñate put it in a letter, the greatest force we possess is the prestige of the Spanish nation, by fear of which the Indians have been kept in check, unquote. Carried along indigenous trade networks, impressions of the Spaniards as cruel and treacherous strangers became widespread among Apaches, Pueblos, Navajos, and other nations. By the way, check into Apaches, whether they prefer to be called a different name or not. Same with Navajo, etc. It's good to check into this, verify. And other nations. Although Oñate's colonizing efforts ultimately failed, Franciscans stayed to save the, quote, field of souls the church could not ignore, unquote. Pueblo communities combine old and new. Figure 220. The San Miguel Chapel in Santa Fe, New Mexico, was originally built in 1610 by Franciscans. It is the oldest Catholic church in the United States. The walls are made of adobe walls, approximately 5 feet thick. Wikipedia. Franciscan priests compelled indigenous people to build churches, plow the fields, and perform other rigorous tasks. However, Pueblos accepted new town governments alongside their own existing ones. Priests forbade traditional native ceremonies and practices, but the Pueblo persisted by combining new and old traditions. Kachina dolls and prayer sticks were forbidden and destroyed. Meanwhile, they sought to change other key elements of native society as well. Missionaries targeted Pueblo women's authority. One significant cultural difference between European and indigenous cultures was their concepts of women's power and sexuality. Traditionally, Pueblo women wielded significant authority due to their control of agriculture and their fertility. In the native world, sexuality is associated with fertility and regeneration, reproduction of offspring and their labor, and the incorporation of husbands and their labor. According to historian Ramon Gutierrez, Pueblo women, quote, were empowered through their sexuality, unquote. Although they experienced full sexual freedom and premarital sex was common, in most cases, women were faithful upon marriage. Sexuality was not constrained by the heteronormative model, nor was it viewed as shameful or something to be hidden. Rather, it was natural and some might say spiritual. The church sought to lessen women's power and influence, fearing that it might emasculate men. Missionaries attempted to reform native sexual behavior, especially premarital sex and polygamy, as part of the attempt to Christianize and Hispanicize them. They kept men and women in separate living quarters to ostensibly protect the women, even those who were married. Lustful thoughts were met with lashes and actions, public punishment and humiliation. New Mexico remained poor, violent, and unstable. Violence, poverty, and isolation marked New Mexico's early history. Santa Fe, the first permanent European settlement in the Southwest, was established in 1610, but few Spaniards relocated to the struggling colony because of the distance from Mexico City and the rugged environment. Without mines, extracting tribute from the Pueblos and enslaving the Apaches became the main source of wealth for New Mexico's governors. For their part, some 50 Franciscan friars had established dozens of missions and secured a few hundred converts by the 1630s. Yet beneath the veneer of control and conversion lurked seething discontents. And we reach the conclusion. Colonized peoples resisted and adapted. So we're connecting coerced African migration to colonial demands for labor. We're recognizing indigenous middle grounds, resistance, and selective adaptation. We're understanding the Atlantic world as a continuing struggle over land, labor, and belief. Colonized peoples resisted, adapted, and survived. European expansion into the Americas introduced both settlers and European authorities to a new situation, an abundance of land and a scarcity of labor. Portuguese, Dutch, and English ships became the conduits for Africans forced to America. The western coast of Africa, the Gulf of Guinea, and the west central coast were the sources of African captives. Wars of expansion and raiding parties produced captives who could be sold in coastal factories. African slave traders bartered for European finished goods such as beads, cloth, rum, firearms, and metal wares. Though ravaged by disease and warfare, Native Americans forged middle grounds, resisted with violence, and accommodated and adapted to the challenges of colonialism. Some adaptations were met with little resistance, such as the adoption of the Spanish language, while others, like priests' attempts to eliminate elements of indigenous religions, caused conflict. Contact with Europeans continued to shape the patterns of life throughout the New World for hundreds of years, but the Europeans kept coming. So, just a little bit of a note, attribution and reuse. This adaptation remains open. So this is from the American YAWP, Chapter 2, Making an Atlantic World. It was edited by Max Floman. So this is the Creative Commons license. And for more information, you can go to their website, AmericanYAWP.com. And you can see that link below. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it. I enjoy bringing this important history to you, as horrendous as it can be. Take care of yourselves. There's a lot that comes up with this kind of information because some of us were not raised understanding and realizing this information. And I think it's a fair an accurate portrayal of what happened, and it's more nuanced, and it demonstrates so much of what has been missing in a lot of our historical educations.